Safe and sound. All right, night 3. The second chapter, known as Chapter 11, The Flight of the Doctor. The Doctor was young, which, he reflected, was a rare pleasure at his time of life. Hang on a sec, let me take these off. Oh dear. That morning in the TARDIS, over tea and jammy dodgers, he found himself remembering his first proper inspection of the face he was wearing now. It had been a busy day already. He was explaining to Clara, who was listening as rapt as always. He'd just had another massive falling out with the Master, who, typically, had gone and turned everyone in the world into a copy of himself. Yes, even you, Clara. Shame I missed that. Cleverly saved an old friend from dying of radiation poisoning, started dying of radiation poisoning, said goodbye to all his best friends because he was dying of radiation poisoning, died of radiation poisoning, regenerated, made a mental note to apologise to all his best friends for possibly overstating the situation with the radiation poisoning, destroyed a garden shed, which had stupidly collided with his TARDIS during a largely successful emergency landing, met a new friend with orange hair, invented fish custard, had a stern word with some giant flying eyeballs who were mucking about on Earth for no good reason, and put an end to the mysterious plans of Prisoner Zero. Plans so mysterious, in fact, that no one ever found out what they were. Before finding time to dash back to the TARDIS and spending 7.5 frustrating hours looking for a mirror. He found one in the 3-fingered hand of a mostly dormant robot clown that stood abandoned and ticking in one of the thickly ivied alcoves of the stone deck. Excuse me. He sat on the stump of a fallen pillar, and there, among the jaggled tumble of ivy-throttled masonry, braced himself for the new hymn. Cheekbones, he thought, staring at his new face. Thin. Ooh, sharp corners. In fact, the planes of his face now seemed so steeply angled that he wondered how they joined up at the back. He popped the mirror behind his head to check, then realised he couldn't see his reflection anymore. He quickly turned his head to have a look, but unfortunately so did his reflection. Ah, he thought with a big smile. I'm an idiot this time. That was good. He always liked being an idiot. He decided to give a delighted little clap, missed with both hands, and accidentally hugged himself. Possibly a little clumsy, he noted, picking up the largest shard of the broken mirror which had somehow gone flying across the room during his attempted clap. There was a lot of hair now, he noticed. Not ginger, sadly, dark brown. Oh, and thick. He made himself a little dizzy, spinning round as he tried to focus on a giant quiff which was now swaying across his brow. When he checked his reflection again, he noticed the ticking clown passing behind him as it shambled off into the cloisters. Probably ought to do something about that some day, he thought. He was just on the point of deciding he might be a bit too handsome for comfort when he turned his face to the side and saw a chin that adorned the lower half of his face like a diving board. "Banana head," he laughed. "Face like a boot. I'm Mr. Moon." Oh, that would do nicely, he decided. Very him, very Doctor. Bit handsome, bit silly, bit like a banana. He did a quick series of calculations in the dust on the floor and realised this was his 11th face. "No, it isn't," breathed a voice in his ear. His hand froze in the dust. Suddenly his heart seemed very loud in the silence of the cloisters. "What, would you deny me?" whispered the voice. The Doctor took a deep, careful breath and fought the voice away. Regeneration angst, that was all. 11th, he said, loud and firmly. And 11, by a lovely coincidence, just happened to be his new favourite number. As he straightened up, he considered another delighted clap, but decided he needed a bit more practice with the arms first. In truth, over the years, he'd really never got his arms under control, growing convinced that his speech centres had somehow been wired to his hands. He now seemed unable to speak a word without both hands fluttering around him, like two birds trying to escape from a net. He was fairly sure the left one was attempting lip-sync. Sometimes he got so distracted by his own gesticulation that he fell silent and his hands just froze in the air. This quirk of accidentally surrendering had proven to be a tactical disadvantage on more than one occasion. Why couldn't his hands just stick to straightening his bow tie like he wanted them to? Clara was laughing silently. He glanced over at her and noticed for the first time that she wasn't there. Oh, he'd done it again. He was always chatting away to people without checking if they were there first. He looked sadly at the 2 cups of tea he poured and remembered that she was at that silly job she insisted on having, even though there was a whole universe of wonders waiting to be explored, and steam engines. He made an attempt at being cross, but ended up sighing. Much as he liked talking to himself, it was more fun with an audience. And so it was, on the morning of the day that would change every aspect of his life forever. The Doctor, formerly known as the Warrior, also known as Last of the Time Lords, who thought bow ties were cool and that purple tweed was simply the ultimate, decided he was bored. Moments later, in a field on the outskirts of London, a lone cow looked round in surprise as a tall blue box appeared out of nowhere. The Doctor popped his head out and reached for the phone inside the little cupboard on the door. He decided one slow evening that, since his space-time machine was stuck looking like a phone box, he might as well get the phone working. "Hello! I'm a perfectly normal bloke, and I wondered if Clara Oswald was coming out to play." Mr. Armitage, the headmaster of Coal Hill School, rolled his eyes audibly. "No, you're the Doctor. You're an alien from space." "Oh, that's a bit racist." "So much for diversity at Coal Hill." "She can come out when the school closes." "That's not for another 73 years, he protested. "Oh, that was a fire. I was referring to today, in fact. There's a staff meeting. She should be free about 5:15. "Fire? What do you mean, fire?" 5:15? Still ages." "You have a time machine." "How did you know that?" "The governor of this school is an old friend of yours." "Is he busy?" "He and Barbara are leaving on their 4th honeymoon right about now." "Tell him to wait. I'm coming along." "No more," breathed Mr. Armitage. "No more what?" asked the Doctor. "I'm sorry," said Mr. Armitage blankly, then added, "Too long have I stayed my hand. No more." "What are you on about, staying your hand?" "I didn't say anything about my hand," sighed Mr. Armitage. "I was saying, if you tell me where you are, I will pass the address on to Miss Oswald, who, I'm sure, will be able to join you later. Today you leave me no choice. Today this war will end. No more. No more." The Doctor gripped the console to steady it, although it wasn't the console that was shaking. That hadn't been Mr. Armitage's voice, not at the end. He knew that voice. "Doctor?" Mr. Armitage was asking. "Doctor no more," whispered something long dead. Why now? Why was he hearing that voice now? It was all over and done with, and forgotten, and never to be thought about again. He closed his eyes fiercely, and pictured all his secret days locked away in an old oak chest at the bottom of a deep green sea. It had always worked before, when his past rose up to claim him. But this time, the chains round the chest were rusted and broken, and the light was starting to rise. He snapped his eyes open in fright, and noticed that the console was shaking worse than ever. "Doctor, are you there?" "Oh, Mr. Armitage." He quickly gave his best guess as to his current address. "There's a field, a cow, and a road," and hung up. No, he thought, pacing the TARDIS, his feet landing in angry clangs on the floor of the brooding steel chamber. No, no, no. Some things were over and stayed over, and that was it, thank you very much. He grabbed his most boring book, sat on his second favourite staircase, and started to read, angrily. It was a book of complex temporal theory, and he'd already lost several days trying to find Wally. He was starting to think that Wally wasn't actually in every book, but how could anyone be truly sure? "You hide yourself in whimsy," said the whisper in his ear. He focused on the boring words and pretended there was nothing to hear. Those days were gone, that darkness had been spent. Of course he knew that wasn't strictly true. The trouble with living in the space-time ship was that however fast you flew, the past never got any further away. It was always waiting just outside the door, and sometimes, as now, the door knocked. But no, he thought, he was going to sit here and read his book and wait for Clara, and when she arrived, they'd fly off and have an adventure, probably with cocktails along the way. The past was the past, the Doctor decided. and in no way, shape or form did it hold any terrors for me. Excuse me. Clara Oswald arrived in the TARDIS in a roar and a high wind, swerved the console and screeched to a halt. He heard her feet clattering on the floor as she dismounted. The Doctor, his eyes still on his book, realised she'd probably come on her motorbike. Showing off as usual, he thought, and in retaliation he kept his back to her and turned a page. "Draft," he said, and heard her snap her fingers. The TARDIS doors slammed themselves shut. He'd begun teaching her that trick years ago in the confident expectation it would take years to master it. But she'd got the hang of it almost immediately, and could even do it in gloves, which had always eluded him. "A field and a cow," said a voice with a Blackpool accent. "Lucky you put a tracker in this thing." "Fancy a trip to ancient Mesopotamia?" he asked, "followed by future Mars?" He looked round, and there she was, taking her helmet off in a swirl of hair, while her motorbike purred into silence behind her. She was giving him one of those looks that made him grateful that those big brown eyes and the cheekiest smile in the universe could never have any kind of effect on a Time Lord such as myself. "Will there be cocktails?" she asked. "On the moon." "The moon will—" The motorbike narrowly missed her face as it bounced upright and then went sideways into a bookcase. The stairs the Doctor was sitting on arced over his head, and the central console was suddenly spinning far above them both as they tumbled around the walls of the control room like socks in a washing machine. Deep beneath the Tower of London, in an unnumbered room which appears on no maps or schematics of any kind, and is never referred to in any documentation, among a labyrinth of shelves and alcoves, and barred doors and sealed chambers, there is a small blue safe, with the word TARDIS on the front. Inside there are a number of sealed envelopes, one of which shows evidence of having been recently steamed open and reclosed. The document contained inside is several typed pages, and concerns the protocol surrounding TARDIS discovery. It notes that the TARDIS is the most powerful and dangerous piece of alien technology to regularly visit the planet, and warns of the dire consequences of it if it were to fall into the wrong hands. It goes on to say that the Doctor is in the habit of parking it in random places, and while entry to the machine is all but impossible, the danger of anyone achieving it is too great to be ignored. On the sighting of the TARDIS, various photos of the police box are appended. By any unit personnel, the location must be phoned to Central Command, who will immediately dispatch a helicopter to airlift the TARDIS to the nearest secure premises. The Doctor will then be informed of its new location, which doesn't usually create a problem, as he rarely remembers where he left it. Underneath the typescript, in jagged handwriting suggestive of anger, is a note from the Doctor, which reads, "Could you please check if I'm still inside it first?" "Would it kill you to knock?" bellowed the Doctor. The wind was shrieking, the helicopter was thundering, and the world was upside down. He was hanging headlong out of the flapping TARDIS doors, phone at his ear, with Clara holding onto his ankles, and the London Thames swaying majestically below him. He'd guessed what had happened the moment the TARDIS had been lifted off the ground, and he dashed straight for the phone when it started to ring. As he threw himself out of the door hundreds of feet above London, he'd reflected, not for the first time, that wiring your principal communications device to the outside of your spaceship was not always practical. He managed to grab the phone and his Clara his ankles. "I'm so sorry," said Kate Lethbridge-Stewart, the head of the United Nations Intelligence Task Force. "We had no idea you were still in there." "You phoned me!" screamed the Doctor, hoping Clara would manage to keep hold. "You've listed this number as your mobile." "It's the TARDIS! How much more mobile do you get?" "He's still in the TARDIS," he heard her say to someone else. "Tell the helicopter pilot to take him straight to the site. We'll meet him there." "Site? What site?" "Doctor, I'm sorry, but you were needed." "Needed? What do you mean, needed?" "By Royal Command." "Royal what?" He was going to ask, but the wind whipped the receiver out of his hand. It whirled in a circle on its cable and cracked him on the back of the head. When his vision cleared, a pair of blank stone eyes were glowering at him from underneath a giant stone hat, and a pigeon was cocking its head at him. Nelson had seen better days, he thought fuzzily. As the statue drifted upwards past him, followed by the weathered old column on which it stood, he realised he was being lowered, head first, into a cordoned-off section of Trafalgar Square, and that far below him a division of unit troops was even now slamming to attention and saluting him. Dazed, upside down, and rotating gently as he descended, the unpaid, unofficial scientific advisor to UNIT attempted to recover some dignity by returning the salute, and hit himself in the face. 20 feet below him, Kate Lethbridge-Stewart suppressed a sigh. She knew the men and women around her were getting their first glimpse of a UNIT legend, so kept her face straight. Next to her, Osgood was barely containing her excitement. She was all big round eyes behind big round spectacles, and now and then she even remembered to breathe. "Inhaler," Kate said, and Osgood took a puff without taking her eyes from above. "You wait," thought Kate. "He's not what you're expecting." "He's an idiot," Kate's father had explained long ago. They were in the unit research institute. Sorry. Oh dear. They were in the unit research institute, and at the far end of a sprawling laboratory, a man with a mass of curly hair and a booming voice was protesting that he had caught in some kind of force field, while a dark-haired young woman patiently disentangled his scarf from a pair of double doors. Kate found herself staring at the scarf. It was stupidly long and multicoloured. Who would wear a scarf like that? Although she was only 7, she'd already guessed that this was the scary, funny man who worked with her father, and who sometimes kept the whole world safe. "The doctor?" "Yes, the doctor," said her father, who always seemed a bit cross when he talked about his old friend. His moustache was twitching as if separately irritated. "I thought you said he was a genius." "He is, of course he is. The most extraordinary genius anyone has ever met." The doctor was booming away again. "Ah, yes, Sarah, yes," he was saying. "But there might have been a force field as well, hmm?" "Then he's not a genius all the time?" asked Kate. "No, it's all the time," said her father with funereal regret. "So when is he an idiot?" "All the time." "That doesn't make any sense," said Kate after a moment's consideration. "Yes, that's about the size of it," he replied. The doctor was striding towards them now, and as always her father straightened his shoulders and put some effort into a smile. Many years later, Kate found herself doing the same. "Doctor," she said, "may I extend the official apologies of UNIT?" "Kate Lethbridge-Stewart, a word to the wise," said a very different version of the same man who was now scrambling to his feet. "As I'm sure your father would have told you," he continued, "I don't like being picked up." "That probably sounded better in his head," said a pretty young woman appearing next to him. She just emerged from the TARDIS, which had now come to rest in the square. "Ah, yes," Kate thought. "Clara Oswald, the school teacher. Where does he find them all?" "I was acting on orders direct from the throne," said Kate, and nodded to Osgood, who, she noticed in sudden horror, was wearing a stupidly long, multicoloured scarf. Dear God, this was no time to be fangirling. Osgood had passed the thick ancient envelope to the doctor, who was now inspecting the wax seal with what looked like alarm. Kate frowned. Alarm, she thought, or could that be guilt? Out loud she said, "Sealed orders from Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth I." "The Queen?" asked Clara, whose eyes had somehow got even wider. "The First? Sorry, Queen Elizabeth I." "Queen Elizabeth the Only," snapped the doctor, who suddenly didn't look like a buffoon any more. She didn't like being numbered, and I sympathise entirely. He looked dubiously at the envelope as if he didn't want to open it. Didn't even want to hold it. So much for his famous curiosity. "How do we know this is genuine?" "Her credentials are inside," she replied. With visible reluctance, the doctor started to break the seal, but Kate laid a hand on his arm. "No," she said. "Inside." And she gestured to the huge, ornate building behind her. "Inside the National Gallery?" asked Clara. "What kind of credentials do you keep in a gallery?" "Nice scarf," said the doctor to Osgood, and left her fumbling for her inhaler as he strode up towards the steps. Clara was already running to catch up. Kate watched them go and kept the frown off her face. The change of mood was quite striking. Sometimes you get the clown, her father had said in his final illness. Sometimes you get the ancient beast. Then he started to laugh, which had set him off coughing again, and she'd had to sit him up and get him some water. When he recovered, he corrected himself. Actually, I think you always get both. And he'd given her that smile which had always comforted her as a child, but now just made him look frail and old. They'd sat in silence with only the clock ticking and the rain at the windows. God, I miss that man, he said at last. Maybe he'll visit tomorrow, she had said, her hand tight on his. Maybe tomorrow, he had smiled, closing his eyes. She could never decide over the years if those were the best or the saddest last words. Excuse me a second. The doctor and Clara were striding in step through the evacuated gallery when Kate caught up with them. Did you know her, Elizabeth I? Clara was asking. United Nations Intelligence Task Force, the doctor replied. I'm sorry? This lot, he said, waving a hand at the various soldiers standing guard around the building. Unit. They investigate alien stuff, anything alien. What, like you? I work for them. You have a job? Why shouldn't I have a job? People have jobs. I'd be brilliant at having a job. You never have a job. Yes, I do. This is it. This is my job. What kind of job could you have? This one. This one I'm doing right now in front of you. The doctor threw an eye roll over his shoulder at Kate. It took an effort, but Kate managed not to slap him. Had he really never mentioned any of it? Clara was obviously at the very least his friend, but he never told her he'd spent years trapped on Earth in her father's protection, working with him. They'd stood guard on the world together. They'd been friends, best friends, she'd thought. She fought down the memory of the dying old soldier in the hospice. Maybe tomorrow. I'm sorry, said a voice in her head, and it almost froze her. She'd been briefed about the doctor's occasional telepathy. Low level, they'd said, and rarely used. I miss him too. Not now, she thought back at him. We've got work to do. She felt her cheeks flush and her jaw tighten. He should have had the damn decency to stay out of her head. As you wish, said the doctor, and stepped politely away. But as I returned to my own thoughts, I took an image of Kate's dying father with me and filed it for later. Alistair waiting for me. One should live with one's sins, I told the young man once. I couldn't remember who or why. Clara was glancing at me, so I kept striding and smiling as she expected. Clown and ancient beast. Was that really what Alistair had thought? Was that what Clara thought, too? I resisted having a look inside her head. In front of us, a pair of doors were being opened, and I forced my mind back to the present. Work to do. I squared my shoulders and tightened my bow tie, and the doctor stepped through the doors. At the far end of a long, darkened room, 2 soldiers were standing on guard, either side of a large painting mounted on an easel. The painting itself was draped in cloth, like it was something forbidden. Or maybe they were just keeping the dust off. Why did he always think it had to be something sinister? He resisted the part of his mind that was now listing all the reasons in chronological order. Kate had stepped ahead of him now and given a nod to the soldiers. The drape was pulled back and an oil painting lit up the room like a fireplace. A shattered city below a black and orange sky. Plunging battleships suspended over a burning skyline, an intricate lattice of stabbing energy beams, running people, frozen in their screams. The doctor could feel the double slamming inside his chest. He wondered if everyone could hear his hearts. Kate's voice now, from far away. Elizabeth's credentials, she was saying. She left an account of where to find this painting and its significance to you. The doctor couldn't find his voice. His eyes were locked on the painting. He felt himself taking Clara's hand, although it wasn't Clara who was afraid. This isn't why you were called here today. This is just proof that the message in your hand is from Elizabeth herself. Obviously, over this amount of time, forgery is impossible. Oh, forgery is a possibility. I do apologise, people. I'm sorry. Nearly there. He tried to make sense of her words over the roar of the painting, but surely no one could. Surely everyone could hear those screams. And then, from deep inside him, from another place, another life, he found himself saying, "No more." "That's the title," said Kate, evidently surprised. I know the title, snapped the doctor, and reached for Clara's hand before remembering he was already holding it. She was shaking, but dimly he realised it might not be her. Also known as Don't Say It, Don't Say It, Don't Say It! Gallifrey Falls, finished Kate. The doctor didn't reply for a moment. He noticed Clara's grip was very tight, and then worried he might be hurting her and released her hand. He willed himself to speak. It's the fall of Arcadia, he said. Gallifrey's second city. Say it. Say it. Just say it. The last day of the Time War. The last day. The floor trembled at his feet. Were there shockwaves coming out of the painting? The last day. He was back on Khan so many faces ago when he was drinking the poison ready to walk into the storm. The last day. The desert was hot beneath his boots, and a tiny barn shimmered on the horizon. The last day. Elizabeth of England tilted her face back to be kissed, but it wasn't really her. Trixie! Okay, dog's off on one. I'm sorry about this. The last day, he was trapped in a cell with two old men who hated him, but the shadows hid their faces. The last day, he was standing in the gallery and Clara was asking him if he was okay. The last day of the Time War. That was wrong, he suddenly realised, because somehow all those different days spread across his life were also the last day. Somehow the last day had become millions of days, each of them impossibly the last. No such thing as last, something screamed in his mind, laughing at him. And understanding arrived like sickness, a truth he had been running from for centuries. A long time ago he had taken a decision to become a warrior, and many years later he'd thought he could walk away from it. How stupid. Of course not. He'd drunk the poison and walked into the storm, and he'd never found his way out. He had forsaken his name, gone to war, and in one terrible moment of unparalleled savagery, slaughtered them all, Time Lords and Daleks alike. Everyone had screamed, and then everything had stopped. The murderer who stood alone and alive in that awful place, in that awful silence, told himself what he'd done was justified, that peace was worth any price, that the war at last was over. He was wrong, of course. The Time War wasn't over. Not for me. Okay, that's the end of the chapter. Sorry about the noise. The dog, the dog loved making bed out of things. Thank you so much for listening to this. I hope it's cheered you up. I hope it's passing any isolation you might be having. More tomorrow night, as always. Okay, we'll keep going. Thank you again. Thank you. Bye-bye.